Well, a very good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Irish American Bar Association of New York for this evening's event. My name is Michael Moran. I'm president of the Irish American Bar Association of New York, and we're very excited to have you all join us for our event this evening, Journey of Hope, the Irish in New York. For those of you who haven't been at an IBNY event before, the Irish American Bar Association of New York is a professional networking organization dedicated to connecting and serving, celebrating New York's Irish legal professionals. Whether you're from Ireland originally, of Irish heritage, or interested in all things Irish, you're very welcome to be a member of the Bar Association. And please check out our newly designed website for more information and for information on joining us. As you may have seen from the invitation, tonight we are giving away 3 Ireland soccer shirts to lucky attendees. So right after the event, the board will conduct a raffle with all the attendee names, and we will be reaching out to the lucky winners. So keep an eye on your emails for that, and the winners will be announced subsequently. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. That's Tara Ryder. Tara received her PhD in history from Stony Brook University, where she was a senior lecturer with the school, where she is a senior lecturer with the School of Marine and Atmospheric Studies. Her research studied how the search for identity and power is indelibly linked to both the people and the landscape of Ireland. At once substantive and symbolic, the linkage of gender and race with landscape raises questions of power, culture, and identity. So we are really honored to have Tara join us tonight, and I'll hand over to Tara to begin.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. Just get that set up. So hello, thank you so much for having me. That was a lovely introduction, so thank you, Michael. I did want to say, if anyone has questions, if you could put them in the chat, I will try to make sure that I get a chance to answer them, but probably towards the end of the talk, because what I've discovered is quite often I will answer it in a couple of minutes when I'm giving these talks. So today we're going to look at Irish American history here and kind of the journey from leaving Ireland and what the experiences were. And I will have to say I was very inspired when I looked at your website, and you had a fabulous quote there that was by Edmund Burke, who said, "People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors." And I thought that was really appropriate as a way to start today's discussion. Because the fact of the matter is, somewhere around 50 million Americans claim Irish descent, with almost as many people outside of the United States scattered around the world also claiming Irish descent, which is really phenomenal when you realize at the point of its highest population, which was in the early 19th century, Ireland only had a population of 8 million. And today it's just a little over 6 million if you look at both the Republic and Northern Ireland. So what we see is that the Irish have definitely influenced American culture, whether you've been to an Irish pub, you sat and listened to whether it was traditional Irish music, or maybe a band like U2. And of course, we have to recognize St. Patrick's Day has become a worldwide celebration. I do have to admit, New York City does not have the oldest parade. St. Augustine, Florida now claims that, but we definitely have one of the best parades. I'm not biased in any way, of course, with that. But you can find St. Patrick's Day celebrations in places like Tokyo. They actually run green beer in the middle of one of their fountains. You have celebrations in places like Moscow, as well as in places in Canada and Australia and England, where there are so many more Irish immigrants. And all of this has led to an interest in Ireland and her history. Even if what many people believed to be true comes more from the imagination of poets and storytellers rather than necessarily from rigorous scholarship of historians and archaeologists. And so that's a little bit of what we're going to explore here today. So if we just take a quick look at Ireland, you know, this tiny island has so many times in the past 5,000 years stood at the heart of European culture. If you go back to the 8th century BC, it is considered one of the wealthiest places in all of Europe. You had beautiful gold jewelry, you had bronze instruments that were basically being considered equal to anywhere, you know, north of Egypt. And one of the things that made Ireland so very unique throughout its history was that it was never absorbed into the Roman Empire. They had contact with the Romans, but Ireland itself was not part of the Roman Empire. And so it has unique cultural heritage that stretches back in some ways all the way back to the Bronze Age. And when Christianity arrived in the 5th century, not only with St. Patrick, but with other missionaries, there was already a very strong spiritual presence on the island. And what makes Ireland unique when we look at this particular part of its history is that, unlike Europe, when you study Christianity and you hear phrases like throw the Christians to the lions, we don't see that happening in Ireland. There's really an extraordinary convergence that will create a unique Christian church whose influence will spread throughout Europe. Ireland, you know, kept scholarship alive in all of Europe in their monasteries during, you know, the early Middle Ages, as much of Europe was struggling to survive. And by the 10th century, we're going to see European kingdoms did not actually think themselves well served unless they had an Irish philosopher or an Irish theologian. And so this small island really ends up having a unique role to play, not only in our history, but in European history. But we're going to focus here on the United States. And we're going to see that the Irish came to the United States both once we were a country and even beforehand when we were colonies for different reasons. They came because of religious persecution. They came for economic opportunities because of the hardships they faced back at home. And many came to simply escape death by starvation. Many of them came as individuals, though we will also see families and small groups coming, but especially those early immigrants left behind everything they knew. There was no festive bon voyage party. One of the phrases that comes out of this early period is what's known as an American wake. The idea that by crossing the Atlantic, that it was permanent, that you were not going to see anyone. It was as permanent and in many ways as silent as death. And we recognize that, you know, they left because they wanted something better. And that's what America represented to them. And they came and they did not necessarily wait to have that opportunity given to them. They definitely took it on their own terms. And that's part of what we're going to take a look at. And they shaped who we as Americans are, and definitely who we as New Yorkers are. Now, I will freely admit, I am not a native New Yorker. You may hear y'all coming out of my mouth. I drink pop, not soda. So definitely not a New Yorker. But for those of you who are New Yorkers, you're probably identified as a New Yorker right away. I take my students to Ireland, and as soon as we get off the plane, everyone's like, oh, you're from New York. Well, the reason I'm highlighting this is the root of the New York accent is the Irish accent. They've done linguistic studies to demonstrate this. So the Irish shaped so many different elements of what it means to be a New Yorker. And so today, I want to take a look at the history of the Irish and the Irish American culture and celebrate it through verse and song, as well as some of this imagery. And one of my favorite quotes that I always like to use when talking about Irish immigration is by Brendan Keneally. And he says, all songs are living ghosts that long for a living voice. And so I'm hoping today to be able to give voice to our history and to our culture here. Now, there are several waves of Irish immigration, and the first major wave of Irish immigration goes right back to the founding of the New York colony in the 1600s. Most of the Irish who arrived here in New York were young, male, and Catholic. And the journey from Ireland to New York took somewhere between 8 to 10 weeks on a crowded ship, in which they were hoping that they would find better opportunities. They were leaving behind this country that they saw as not giving them the opportunities. They did not have the chance to own land. They wanted a place of their own. But we also recognize that when they arrived here, they very much still longed for that country that they left behind. And this is part of what we have to think about. So the act of voluntarily leaving one's homeland did not actually have a word in Irish Gaelic in the 17th century. They used instead the word for exile, because for them, it wasn't that the Irish did not leave Ireland. If you study Irish history, we were known as wanderers. That's why you can go to places like Poland and find an Irish university where 80% of their students are fluent in Gaelic, because the Irish wandered. But the idea with wandering is that you always come home. Coming to the colonies was an exile. There was no return trip. So we do have to recognize that this was about opportunity, and it would take something desperate to leave Ireland behind. Now, when we're looking at Irish history in the 17th going into the 18th century, there had been an attempt to obliterate native ways. And this is part of what's known as the penal laws. And it was an idea that the English would subjugate what they described as the barbarous Irish. And it made things like playing traditional instruments like the harp illegal. And part of the emphasis that the English put on music is the fact that the Irish used music as a way to protest, as a way to tell stories. And so we are going to take a look at a lot of the songs, and that's what you see here. So during the period of the 17th into the early 18th century, the estimate is around 100,000 Irish left and came here to America, with most of them coming to the New York area. Again, I do want to emphasize they were young, single, Catholic, and male. They often had few ties once they arrived here in America. But as this song says, they were in search of fame, fortune, and sweet liberty. Now, there were lots of obstacles towards gaining these ideas. First, the cost was quite high. It was basically the equivalent of somewhere around 6 to 12 months of hard labor in Ireland. And the trip itself was not easy. You were in a damp, insect-infested ship with diseases running rampant through the ship. Many of the Irish were buried at sea because of diseases like dysentery and cholera during this time. And those that did arrive faced an uncertain future. What we see with these early kind of waves of Irish immigrants is that most of them end up being loners, that they're simply seeking a place to work, a place to put down roots. They're not creating what we really think of as a Irish community. And one element that we see coming out is that many of them give up their religion because they are surrounded by Protestantism, and that is a defining element of many of these colonies, whether it's the New York colonies, but especially if you're in the New England area. This starts to change, though, as we get into the 18th century. You start to get what's known as the Scotch-Irish immigration. And what had happened was during the Tudors and into the Stuart period, in an attempt to Protestantize as well as colonize Ireland fully, We have the English planting Scots especially in Northern Ireland. And these were the ideas of plantations. And the idea was that this would help to Protestantize Ireland and bring it further under English control. For the Scots, this ends up kind of putting them into what we would probably describe as a second-hand citizenship. They're not English, so they're not at the top, but they're also not Irish. They are not always necessarily able to buy land. They still have to pay a tithe, not only to their church, but still to the Church of England. And we see that many of them come to resent the English landlords. And we get a mass migration coming out of especially Northern Ireland, coming here into the colonies. And most of them will come in through New York, but they quickly push into what in the early 18th century would have been considered the frontier. So Northern New York, they were pushing into Pennsylvania, and ultimately down along the Appalachian Mountains. And they left, Ireland very much because they were poor. They wanted the opportunity to own their own piece of land and not have the English dictating to them how they should live. They did not want to have to pay a tithe to the Church of England. They will put down deep roots in many of these areas. And when the American Revolution occurs, they will end up being very, very influential because they will come out very strongly on the side of the Patriots. And they actually make a huge impact in the direction our war goes. So if you look at the American Revolution early on, our patriots were not necessarily always the best trained. The first major battle after the Declaration of Independence was the Battle of Long Island, which is also known as the Battle of Brooklyn. And let's just say the Patriots lost it pretty spectacularly. New York was lost to the Patriot cause. And part of that is the fact that Long Islanders didn't really have to shoot for a living. They were no longer fighting. They had become tradesmen and merchants and farmers. The turning point to some degree in the war was when you get the Virginia Mountain Men, which are actually these Scotch Irish who had come into New York and then spread through the Appalachian Mountains. They were said to be able to hit the eye of a running squirrel at 300 yards. Now, I don't know about you. I don't think I can see a squirrel at 300 yards, let alone find its eye to shoot it out. But these were men who lived with their weapons, and they will become very, very influential in helping us win some of the critical battles that will turn the tide of the American Revolution. That is the period that we typically think of as the first wave of Irish immigration. And as you can see, it is, especially towards the end, still Protestant, and even those early Catholics end up giving up their religion. The wave that most people are familiar with is what we consider the second wave of immigration. And that is the wave that happens between 1845 and 1851 and thereafter. And this is during the Ungutta Mort, the Great Hunger, when a potato blight wipes out the crops in Ireland 4 out of those 6 years. And you have absolute devastation to the population. We recognize that at least 1 million men, women, and children died, and somewhere around 2 million more of the Irish will emigrate, going to places like England, Canada, Australia, and the United States. They come to the US in large numbers. Now, they left on what were often known as coffin ships. And one of the things that we can see if you study the period of the Irish famine in Ireland is that English landlords decided that it would be cheaper and more economical to actually push the people off their land and raise sheep. And so they paid for the Irish to actually leave Ireland because they didn't want them to have the chance to come back. And so if you think about it, if you're paying for someone to leave, they are costing you money. You're not putting them on the best ships. Many of the ships that crossed the Atlantic were on their last legs. A wooden vessel from this time period had a lifespan of about 20 years, and many of these coffin ships were 30 and 40 years old. So some of them never even made it. Many of them also had diseases like dysentery, typhoid, cholera ran rampant. We recognize today that many of the Irish did not die of starvation. They died of the diseases related to all of this. And they come and they flee Ireland. And the irony is that Ireland was actually producing enough food to feed its entire population at this time. But due to the system of absentee landlordism, that profit is going back to the landlords. And so we see the Irish migrating to different parts of the world. But as I said, you're going to see that the United States will end up with some of the largest numbers of the Irish. And we're going to focus because this is where we really see the Irish arriving in New York. Now, there has been a long silence about the famine, and the search for one's ancestor often kind of ends with the stark realization you may never find who your ancestors were past a certain point. We know that many of the records were lost by about the third year of the famine. The estimate is that over a half of Ireland was basically wandering. They were searching for food, they were searching for opportunities. People died along the roads, and that included the priests who would often have the local records. So we know that there's a blankness that occurs. And this poem kind of sums up some of those experiences. When you come to look for your family roots, ask for the famine field. There's likely one in every parish or corner of some great estate now ruined. The land staked out by tenants who survived to make their claim. Not everyone will tell you where they are, but you can tell. The darker grass, the land sunk beneath the fields above, but you will know if any one of yours is buried there. And you will see as you wander through, especially Western Ireland and places in Southern Ireland, that you can still see many of the cottages that were partially knocked down during this period. But again, we recognize today, Ancestry.com says that over a quarter of everyone who is going on there is looking for their Irish ancestry. And they often hit a point where they simply can't find records going back past the middle of the 19th century. This starts a massive wave, though, of emigration coming to the United States, specifically coming to New York. The estimate is that over the next 60 years, somewhere around 5 million people will leave Ireland for the United States. And this journey continues long after the famine itself has ended. And typically by the time we're getting to the end of the 19th century, it's about a 2 to 3 week trip. And so they're crossing over, they're looking for that opportunity. Today, we recognize that often the first thing they saw kind of welcoming them to New York was actually the Montauk Lighthouse, because they would go past that as they headed in. It was the sign that they had arrived in the United States. And there was definitely the idea that this would be a land of opportunity. But I'm sure many of you are familiar with the phrase, "No Irish need apply." We recognize that there was massive prejudice against the Irish immigrants during this time period. We'd seen a rise in what's known as nativism, the idea of having to be 100% American, having been born in the United States, to parents who were born in the United States. And it is something that we have to recognize occurred here. Here's two newspaper articles definitely showing the "No Irish need apply." Now, there is a little bit of an issue here. A lot of the signs that you can find, you'll find them in antique stores saying "No Irish need apply," are actually not from New York or even from the US. If you flip them over, you'll often find that they say "Made in London." And I would like to say that by the end of the 19th century, New Yorkers were quite capable of making a good sign. We did not need to import our signs from from London. And we do recognize that New York is one of the most photographed cities in the world not only today, but historically. I want to be clear, this prejudice was there, but much of the signage was actually not part of our history. It was much more in the print than actually in signs. But this is part of what we think of as cultural baggage. This prejudice of signs and of advertisements like what you're seeing here were definitely found in places like London, and they crossed over as part of that British cultural baggage. Here in New York, it definitely existed, but I will say most of the signs are not actually original to our area. So it is something to be a little bit aware of. The Irish, though, faced not only prejudice, but they faced crushing poverty. They lived in relatively squalid conditions in parts of New York City. This is where we're going to see the rise of places like 5 Points being an Irish community. But many of them also tried to send assistance back home. We have a letter from Martin O'Gara, who was a ditch digger in the late 1860s in New York City. And he said, "My dear wife, do not fret that I have forgotten you and our little ones. I have steady work and I do not drink away my wages, but have saved £5, which I now send you to feed the children. With the help of God in my next letter, I will pay your passage and bring you all to join me in this land of plenty." And that's something that we have to think about. For all of the hardship, all of the prejudice they faced, for them, it was still a better opportunity than what they had left behind at that time. Now, part of what made their struggle so hard is that when we look at the immigrants that came during the second wave, majority of them were illiterate. They were often unskilled, and many of them did not speak English at all, something that we don't always associate with Irish immigration, but we associate with, say, Italian immigration. They were coming from Western Ireland, and Irish was their primary language. And we will see that this mass emigration from Ireland actually leads to a decline in the Irish language, in people speaking it fluently during this period. And what we will see is in the 19th century, that the Irish will be the leading immigrant group to the United States, and they are considered America's first urban underclass. By 1860, out of the 800,000 residents of New York City, a quarter of them are Irish. Another quarter of them are children of Irish immigrants, which suddenly explains why the New York accent is based on the Irish accent. Half your population was growing up hearing those voices. Now, when you look at these images, we do have to recognize that disease ran rampant through much of these tenements. Tuberculosis was very, very common in Irish neighborhoods, and Irish infant mortality was the highest of any group in the United States. Now, this becomes particularly visible when we look at male Irish immigrants during this period. As I said, many of them came over illiterate and unskilled, so they took on manual labor. They were ditch diggers, they were miners, they were cartmen, they were dock workers. And these were jobs that were not necessarily always steady work, and were often working conditions that were dangerous and what we would see as unhealthy. Long hours, little pay. And male famine survivors typically lived less than 10 years after arriving in the United States. Much of this was due to diseases. Their bodies were already weakened, so things like tuberculosis and typhus. We do also have to recognize the issue with alcohol. And so, I always talk to my students about this. St. Patrick is turning over in his grave over what we do on his holiday here in New York and other places. He is an interesting figure because we actually have two of his own writings. We have his autobiography, and we have a letter to a contemporary hero of the day that very simply basically says, stop whoring, stop partying, and stop drinking. So he would be appalled at all this idea of, the Irish and alcohol being associated together. But what this comes from is actually an old tradition from the Middle Ages that came over from Europe and came over as part of that cultural baggage. In the Middle Ages, they started to pay journeymen, those who were doing kind of the worst work, part of their wages in alcohol, because it was how they would get them to come back after a hard day. And that practice is a practice that arrives here in New York. And so imagine being a ditch digger. 52 weeks a year, you get all of the best weather, you get the intense heat of New York City in the summer, you get the cold winds and snows in the wintertime, and you're working 6 days a week. At the end of Saturday, they're going to pay you part of your wages in alcohol. And the idea that you're going to put up your feet, drink some of that, and forget about how awful your job was so you would come back on Monday. Of course, these are the same people going, shame on you for drinking. Drinking makes you abusive. So there is kind of this tension that plays out. And there is ultimately issues with alcoholism that we will see. Now, for those of us who are ladies, we would have actually been in a slightly better position than the male immigrants, mainly because many of our jobs were inside. So we're working as cooks, we're working as servants, or we're working in the factory. So we're not necessarily working outside in some of the kind of, poor weather. And what's interesting is that women sometimes made better wages than the men did. In factory work, because we were seen as having smaller hands, we could often do some of the more complicated machinery. And jobs like being a cook would bring in more money. So the larger image that you see here is from Castle Gardens. And Castle Garden was the original immigration site prior to Ellis Island. Ellis Island opened in, I believe, 1890. But Castle Garden after that became a site of employment. So if you were looking to find a job, you would go down there. And if I was looking for a cook and maybe a parlor maid, I could sit there and interview you and go, can you cook this? Can you cook that? I might, look at the parlor maid, because of course I want a parlor maid that would be pretty enough to be able to say, look at my lovely house, but not so pretty that she's going to tempt my husband in any way. And this is something we do have to recognize. One of the challenges that the women faced was that many of them had come unattached. They did not necessarily have family with them to help protect them. And so many of these female servants also faced what today we would define as sexual harassment. And the idea that they had very little maneuvering that they could do. And so if, unfortunately, if they became pregnant, they would be let go with, no recommendation. It could become very hard for them to find a job. But we are going to see that the Irish will, by 1860, make up 87% of New York City's unskilled labor. And they start to create a sense of camaraderie. And this actually is shown in various organizations. Probably one of the better known ones is the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which actually dates back to even an earlier period. But again, you're going to see that this second wave of Irish immigrants starts to form tight communities, something we didn't really see with the first wave. Now, unfortunately, most of America was ready to accept the image of the Irish as irresponsible, flawed individuals, stereotypes that you would have seen in Europe and Britain. And this is a really good example of this. This was actually published in the Brooklyn Eagle, as well as in other newspapers in both New York and outside of New York. So it shows, the lovely Florence Nightingale and then Bridget McBruiser. The idea is that the Irish were basically animals. And one of the other ideas that comes out of this is that Irish poverty was seen as a sign of laziness, of immorality, ignorance, and superstition. And so one of the things that we'll see coming out of this is the idea of Irishness and being Catholic becoming entwined together. Now, I want to be clear that the Irish did not take this sitting down. While they were seen as being unable to be mixed in to America, and much of this was the fear of the Catholicism, the idea that as a Catholic, you'll listen to the Pope before the president, so you can never be patriotic. The Irish don't take this, as I said, sitting down. They definitely protest in songs and in poems, and this was one that you could have heard on the streets of New York in the 1870s and the 1880s. Not only did they protest in song, they also start to create the parochial school system. I don't know how many of you went through Catholic schooling. I know I had 12 years of Catholic schooling, but it was a way to keep Catholicism in their lives, but also to create these tight-knit communities. And it helps the Irish to carve a foothold in American society because they're now becoming educated, as well as retaining that sense of Catholicism. Now, one of the things that does help initially to push the Irish up the socioeconomic ladder is the Civil War. So the Civil War, takes place in 1861 to 1865 and needs a massive number of men to fight. The majority of the Irish do fight on the side of the Union, and the Union Army actually had a recruiting station in Dublin. They basically said if you would fight for the remainder of the war, they would pay for your way to come to the United States, and you were basically given the equivalent of about 10 years worth of wages in Ireland. So it was considered a huge opportunity. And the Irish started to be known for their gallantry. Some of you may be familiar with the Fighting 69th. It was a New York Irish regiment that fought in every major battle of the Civil War. They are still together today. They are, I believe, currently in Afghanistan. They should be coming home soon. And you will still see, as they say, a lot of nicks and O's amongst the men. Unfortunately, there is also some tension here. We're going to see that the Irish will riot in the summer of 1863 in New York City, and they actually do $5 million worth of damage to the city. And if you ever take a walking tour of 5 Points, you can actually still see a cannonball that the Union Navy fired into New York City to disrupt the riot. So there is tensions throughout this whole period. Now, my favorite part that comes out of this is after the Civil War, many of the Irish had fought so that they would gain experience in fighting so that they could fight the British. And so some of those Irish Civil War veterans actually attempted to invade Canada twice, because their idea was that they would capture Canada and basically hold it hostage in exchange for Ireland. I always say that evidently those Catholic schools did not teach geography very well. And so you can still see that there are places that still have this as memorial plaques here. Now, as we look through this time, we do have to recognize the role that politics and patronage, especially in New York City, plays. So if we look at them during this period, they are mainly affiliated with the Democratic Party. And we're going to see that they will end up taking over Tammany Hall. A lot of people are familiar with Tammany Hall because of Boss Tweed, who was not Irish, but the men who took over after him were. And one of his henchmen admitted that American urban politics was a filthy pool of shabbiness, falsehood, and corruption. And many people feared that this was the Irish conquest of our cities. But it played a critical role in Irish development of putting down roots. They were able to start to get involved in politics. We're going to see during this period, in partly through support of organizations like Tammany Hall, but we see this in other cities as well, that they will start to join the police department. I'm sure many of you have probably seen the New York City St. Patrick's Day parade, where it's, basically in the police department, you have an Irish police pipe band, fire department pipe band, another police department. Those roots go back to the 19th century, because the idea was that we will control the law through being the law. And so you have them joining the police department. They get involved in politics, especially in the period from like the 1880s to the 1920s. We'll even see that you get in the late 1920s, Al Smith, who is of Irish heritage, Irish and Italian heritage, had been governor of New York, will try to run for president. He's the first Catholic to run for president. So you see the Irish getting very much involved. And it may have been what we call dirty politics, but it created a crucial system of support for many of the Irish. They developed, pride in themselves. And Patrick Dunny wrote in his letter from this period, "I'm an American citizen and had the honor of voting in the last 2 elections." They are now starting to be involved, and they see themselves working their way up the ladder. Now, as we get into the 20th century, we do have to recognize that they face challenges. One of them is World War I. The US comes in on the side of Great Britain, and the Irish want to support their adopted country. They want to fight for the US flag, but there's also still what is happening in Ireland. And so we see kind of a twofold response. So from 1919 to 1921, when we have the Irish War for Independence, we are going to see that the Irish here in the United States raise around $10 million to support the Irish cause, at the same time that they had also, before this, been fighting and supporting World War I. One elderly immigrant had declared in the early 1920s that they had proven themselves 100% American and kept faith with dear old Ireland, that they were able to be both American and still be Irish at this time. But that gets to be really kind of problematic as we look at it. The question of what does it mean to be Irish American? In the 1900 census, 2/3 of those labeled Irish American were actually born in the United States. Yet we still had around 30,000 immigrants coming from Ireland. So you've got kind of this push and pull of what does it mean to be Irish? What does it mean to be Irish American? 2/3 were still what we would consider blue collar workers, but thanks to the changes in the socioeconomic ladder, more and more we're getting into what we think of as white collar jobs. And so one of the things we start to see in the 1920s is that a lot of Irish Americans leave Irish organizations like the AOH. Instead, they join what are seen as simply Catholic organizations, the Knights of Columbus. It's that question of what is identity? Are they American? Are they Irish? Where does this fall into? And we do have to recognize that by the 1920s, in a large part due to the influx of Irish immigrants, Catholicism in the United States had changed from a really small, insignificant church to the largest and wealthiest denomination in America. And that Irish and Irish American clergy efforts had become legendary. In 1920, you had 50,000 Irish nuns teaching 1.7 million students in 5,000 parochial schools. Most of those students had Irish parentage. Not only was the church supporting Irish American movement up the socioeconomic ladder through education, it was also even more basic than that in the building of the churches themselves. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with St. Patrick's in New York City, but we actually have several other St. Patrick's. So you have St. Patrick's in Glen Cove, Long Island. We have St. Patrick's in Bayshore. And at one point, there were well over 25 St. Patrick churches on Long Island. And it's a really interesting way to study immigration is those churches moved further and further onto Long Island as the Irish were able to afford to move onto Long Island. And we also see the transition as some of those churches in areas like Brooklyn will go from being St. Patrick's to being St. Anthony's as the Italians start to push in and the Irish move a little bit further out. So churches are an interesting way to study immigration. Today, many of those churches now celebrate Hispanic saints. So again, we see kind of elements of immigration coming through here. Now, as we push forward in time, you get the 1930s, you get the 1940s, and we get movie stars like James Cagney, my favorite Maureen O'Hara, Jimmy Stewart, Bing Crosby, and they had what were often described as Irish qualities of toughness and charm, but it appealed to everyone. And in the 1930s, 1940s, there is a push to really be American, and that to celebrate that the Irish were now part of America, that they had become part of what was often described as that melting pot. And we're going to see in the years after World War II an idea that it was okay to celebrate your Irish heritage. So the first Irish dance feis or competition that was held on a large scale was actually held in upstate New York at the Theodore Roosevelt estate up there. And it was very stylized. So men, if you were competing, you would have had your shillelagh in hand, but it was the idea that you could celebrate your Irish heritage. Even, as we recognize that the idea of going home to Ireland was still prohibitive. It was still expensive to cross the Atlantic in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. You weren't casually popping home. But there's more of a recognition that you can celebrate Irish culture, Irish heritage. You start to see authors like Yeats gaining popularity here in the United States during this time period. And of course, we have more and more pipe bands that you see. Every parade today on St. Patrick's Day has to have at least one piper. The smallest St. Patrick's Day parade in New York is actually out in Amagansett. It's known as the Amagansett Parade. It is all of not even a block long, but it always has one piper. There's only one problem here, which I suspect some of you may be familiar with. These aren't Irish pipes. These are Scottish pipes. Irish pipes, the Aeolian pipes, are actually played sitting down. So they're not very good for parades. But if you think about it, how many people associate seeing an image like this with celebrating one's Irish heritage? And we have to think that by the time we get to the 1990s, you get the phenomenon of river dance. So river dance came out of one of the award shows in Europe. The idea was to celebrate the Irish heritage through dance at the Eurovision Awards. Now, what I always thought was one of the great ironies was they wanted to have the best of the best for the dancers and the musicians. The two lead dancers, well, he came from South Chicago, and Jean Butler, who is the lead female dancer, is from Long Island. They actually helped to import the Irish dancers to Ireland. And I'm sure, as many of you know, Irish dancing became a Broadway phenomenon with River Dance, Feet of Flames. And I will admit, I am probably a little biased here. So I've been an Irish dancer since I was 3, and I am now a teacher out of school. And about half of my dancers aren't Irish at all. When I was a kid growing up doing Irish dancing, I was as uncool as could be, because I did this weird thing called Irish dancing, and then river dance hit, and suddenly it is a phenomenon. And as I said, about half my dancers are not Irish. They do it because they think it's a beautiful form of art, and they want to celebrate the culture. But it is something that we have to recognize, how the Irish have shaped New York, have shaped the United States. So American by birth, Irish by the grace of God. And it is something that I want us to think about, that the story of the Irish coming to America is really the story of immigration in general. The idea of coming, why you come, what you experience, and how you become part of the American culture, and how you bring your unique culture and incorporate it into what is already here. And as I said, the churches are a really great example of showing how we have these different waves. So I attempted to take what is usually a much longer talk and combine it down, because I know it's a beautiful day out there. We probably all want to be outside enjoying some sunshine. So if you do have questions, I am more than willing to answer. I do see the comments about Timothy. I know that there is a couple of people overseas, and that's really who I was thinking of, mainly because one of my friends is over there. So that's where I was kind of thinking on it. Again, this is sometimes the hardship of trying to take what I actually do in 15 weeks and put it into not even an hour. So if any of you are interested in Irish history, Irish American history, we have courses at Stony Brook. That means I don't have to teach at the speed of light. Oh, wonderful. I see that someone's got one of their families is a founding family of St. Patrick's in Glen Cove. As we still have a couple of St. Patrick's churches here, but many of them have actually changed names. It is, as I said, kind of a fascinating story of immigration. I see we have a link here for an Irish immigrant who was a casualty of World War I in the 1918 pandemic. There is, again, some really interesting parallels, obviously, between 1918 and today. It's one of the things I've been teaching in both my American history classes, and then I also teach Western Civ, so we did the Black Death and the pandemic. Your family is mentioned in Ulysses. Oh, wow, that is absolutely fascinating. I've actually been in Dublin when they do the full reading of that. So now I'm going to have to go back and reread it and actually find that. I would like to say, there is so much wonderful information about the Irish in New York and how the Irish really shaped identity. As I said, from things as simple as how we talk to the holidays we celebrate. But again, some of it is wrapped up more in, kind of the storyteller's art. And that is one of the things that I've always associated with being Irish, is the art of storytelling, which is what I can definitely say my mom and my grandmother had. Oh, so, well, welcome to New York. Since you've been here, so we claim you as a New Yorker after 3 years, if they're willing to claim me and my yawling. My students did say I'm almost a New Yorker. I've only been here for 30 some years. But it will take, I think, a little while before I can get rid of the yawl and the pop. Well, if anyone has questions, I will put my email in the chat, so please feel free to reach out to me. I check my email probably more than I should, so usually I'll get back to you pretty promptly. But again, please take a moment and explore New York's history. There is, in a non-COVID world, which I don't know when this will be, a really great walking tour of 5 Points that does highlight some more of this kind of Irish American history, and it gives you a chance to kind of look at where these immigrants lived and some of what their experience would have been like. So I hope you have a wonderful night.
Well, Tara, thank you very much indeed on behalf of the board for joining us and for your wonderful presentation. I think that we all really enjoy hearing about the Irish story in New York and in America. It was a really excellent presentation, so thank you. And once again, thank you to everyone who joined. We had over 60 people with us tonight, so it's a wonderful turnout. Please watch out for Irish American Bar Association events coming up. We have a CLE program next month, and then we have hopefully our Zooms Day event again in June, and some follow-on events virtually, and then hopefully before the end of the year, we'll be back to some in-person events if circumstances permit. So once again, everyone who's joined us tonight will be entered into a draw, and we want to thank Outer Stuff, which is the US licensee for Umbro, the Irish soccer jersey seller here in the US. And hopefully 3 of you will be receiving an email from us shortly with good news. And for everyone else, in the invite, you will find a discount code for the Irish American Bar Association. All of our friends for a limited time and members are able to purchase online, not just the Irish shirt, but whatever other shirts and merchandise are on sale by Umbro in the US. So please look into that code if you want to make some purchases. And with that, I will thank Tara once again for joining us and wish you all a really nice evening and hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Tara.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. It's what great.
Joy.